Welcome to the Wars of the Roses podcast. The Wars of the Roses is a fascinating portion of English history. It changed a great deal about England at the time, bringing about the end of the 331-year rule of the Plantagenets, still the longest reigning dynasty in British or English history. It paved the way for one of the most famous and infamous dynasties in the world, the Tudors. Without the Wars of the Roses, we would never have had much cause to hear about the line descended from a Welsh servant, and even further back from Welsh royalty, that itself radically altered England forever. The wars lasted for most of the second half of the 15th century, with occasional outbreaks of peace. The period was, some time later, named for the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster that disputed the right to the English throne. But there is far more to the story than that. There are around 150 species of rose at present, and easily as many disputes, small and large, that contributed to the Wars of the Roses. With a cast including 5 kings, characters such as Warwick the Kingmaker, Lady Margaret Beaufort and Thomas Lord Stanley, and with the crown passing back and forth, it is a fascinating tale of murder, betrayal, intrigue, love and death. There are unknown fates, reputations that live on today, and one of the most contentious kings and alleged crimes in English history. When considering how, where or why the Wars of the Roses originated, the blame must be laid in part at the feet of King Edward III. Edward was King of England for 50 years, and is considered to have been, by almost any measure, one of the most successful medieval monarchs. Under threat from Edward and his mother, Isabella of France, his father Edward II abdicated in favour of his son. Edward's rule was long and bathed in glory with military success in France, progressive legislation and the continued development of Parliament, alongside the establishment of the chivalric Order of the Garter. In his later years, though, it is likely that Edward suffered one or more strokes and fell into a period of inactivity that led to military failures by his sons and a surge of abuse of the power that he was forced to spread out. His rule had not been without severe problems too. Edward's reign had seen the country and its people ravaged by the Black Death. Edward and his wife, Philippa of Hainault, were blessed with 9 children who survived childhood, 5 sons and 4 daughters. Edward had worked hard to find good marriages for all of his children amongst the royalty of Europe in his efforts to expand his dynasty's influence, yet this brought with it the problems of ambitious children keen for the main prize. The eldest son and heir to Edward III was Edward, the Black Prince. He was a famed military leader, defeating the French at Crécy and Poitiers, and appeared set to reign in his father's mould, though he had also developed a reputation for harsh cruelty, often ignoring accepted notions of chivalry both on the battlefield and off it. For example, he employed flank attacks to defeat enemies, and often sacked and burnt towns to disrupt France, actions considered beyond the rigid bounds of the chivalric rules of war that dominated medieval Europe. Edward III's other sons were Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, who died in 1368, aged 29, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, and Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. It is from John that the House of Lancaster traced its claim, and from Edmund that the House of York descended. On the 8th of June 1376, at the age of 45, Edward the Black Prince died at Westminster, leaving his 9-year-old son Richard as the heir to his grandfather's throne. On the 21st of June the following year, 1377, Edward III died also, making his grandson King Richard II at the age of 10. Due to fears that John of Gaunt would usurp the throne, he was excluded from the council that ruled in the young king's name, though in reality retained a great deal of power and influence. Richard's minority was long, and marked primarily by the peasants' revolts, during which Richard personally reached agreement with the rebels, only to go back on his word. Towards the end of the 1390s, Richard slipped into a period of tyranny, executing nobles, including his uncle Thomas. A dispute arose between John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, and Thomas de Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. Richard banished both men, but Henry returned, landing at Ravenspur in Yorkshire in June 1399. Initially claiming that he only wanted to regain the Lancastrian lands and titles of the recently deceased John of Gaunt, Henry eventually claimed the throne, and Richard was forced to abdicate. Richard's final fate is unclear, but it is possible he starved to death in captivity. Henry Bolingbroke ruled as King Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king. His reign was marred by rebellions in England and Wales, and the manner in which he obtained the throne haunted him. He was a usurper until his death in 1413. His son, Henry V, has passed into legend following Agincourt and the conquests made in France. It is likely that the testing of his own legitimacy as King of England preoccupied the pious Henry as much as a bid to seize the French crown during the campaign. He placed the Lancastrian right to the throne before God for judgment in battle, and he won. In 1422, Henry V died on campaign, leaving a 9-month-old son to take the throne as King Henry VI. Henry's minority was longer still than Richard II's. His uncle Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, acted as protector in England, while another uncle, John, Duke of Bedford, became regent of the French territories. King Henry VI was a man deeply unsuited to the position into which he was born. Henry became King of England on the 31st of August 1422, aged 9 months upon the death of his father. He was also heir to the French throne following his father's successes. The long minority of Henry VI finally ended in 1437, when Henry was declared to have come of age and took the reins of government. In a fashion, at least. Henry emerged from his sheltered years, blinking into the dazzling light of a world for which he was ill prepared. He was pious, quiet, and shy. Disliking war, bloodshed, and the frivolity of court life, Henry began to favour peace with France. He was supported in this by Cardinal Beaufort, his great-uncle, and by William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk. Hungry to continue pressing English claims in France, were the king's uncle Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, and his most powerful subject, his cousin, Richard, Duke of York. Cardinal Beaufort and the Earl of Suffolk prevailed, and were instrumental in arranging Henry's marriage to Margaret of Anjou, a niece of King Charles VII of France. The Treaty of Tours was agreed, but its key provisions were kept secret from Parliament. Henry had agreed to cede Maine and Anjou, and not to receive any dowry for the marriage. The wedding took place on the 23rd of April 1445, and the hard-won territories were lost. Two factions emerged at court, and it was Henry's inability to resolve this conflict or control the parties that set the foundations of civil war. On one side, William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, the now elderly statesman Cardinal Beaufort, and his nephew Edmund Beaufort, now the second Duke of Somerset following the death of his brother John, had the favour of the king and perhaps more importantly his forceful queen. They sought peace with France and were securing significant patronage at court. Opposing them were Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and Richard, Duke of York. Richard was Henry's heir presumptive until the king had a child and favoured hostility with France, resenting the increasing influence of Suffolk and Somerset. The personal rivalry between York and Somerset was to become the beating heart of the troubles that engulfed the country. The king's uncle Humphrey became a target for the opposing faction. His unpopular second wife, Eleanor Cobham, was arrested on charges of witchcraft and heresy in 1441, found guilty of treasonable necromancy, imprisoned for life, and forced to divorce Humphrey. In 1447, with the support of the king and queen, Suffolk and Somerset had Humphrey charged with treason. He was arrested and died in custody, possibly of a heart attack, though rumours abounded that he had been poisoned. York was dispatched to Ireland, where he ruled for the king, gathering much support to the House of York, a bond that was to become invaluable, but in little doubt that it was effective exile. Lines were drawn at the court of King Henry VI. Conflict developed that the king was unable to bring to resolution, and it is at this point that tensions reached breaking point. Henry would contribute hugely to the evolving problems, driving powerful men from his cause and failing to resolve increasingly bitter feuds amongst his most powerful subjects. His intermittent absences from later events exacerbated matters still further, until the very position that God had granted him came under threat. The dispute between York and Somerset was brought to a violent head at the First Battle of St Albans in 1455, when Somerset was killed. In spite of 2 successful spells as protector of the realm during Henry VI's illnesses, York was still marginalised and eyed with an edgy suspicion. A fragile peace endured until 1459, when hostility erupted once more. This spell saw the battles of Blore Heath on the 23rd of September 1459 and Ludford Bridge on the 12th of October the same year, after which the Yorkist faction was driven into exile and attainted for treason. York's eldest son, Edward Earl of March, returned from Calais in 1460 with his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, and his uncle, the Earl of Salisbury. London threw open its gates, and Edward continued north to give battle to the king at Northampton on the 10th of July 1460. Henry was captured and forced to acknowledge York's claim to his throne. Agreement was reached allowing Henry to remain as king, but York was appointed his heir. Henry had effectively disinherited his own son. Margaret of Anjou was not going to take such an affront lightly. York marched north to confront the Lancastrian force Margaret was gathering, but battle was joined before Edward's reinforcements had reached his father, and York, along with his second son Edmund and the Earl of Salisbury, were killed at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460. Edward, now Duke of York, was the head of his house, aged only 18. He engaged the swelling Lancastrian force from Wales at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross on the 2nd of February 1461, after which Owen Tudor, the king's stepfather and grandfather to the future King Henry VII, was beheaded. As Warwick awaited Edward's army, he was himself attacked at St Albans in the second battle there on the 17th of February 1461. Warwick was defeated and lost the person of King Henry. Edward had declared himself King Edward IV in London and now set about pressing his new claim. This period of conflict came to a head in Yorkshire during March 1461. As the armies converged, there was a skirmish at the Battle of Ferrybridge, where Yorkist reinforcements won the day, but the following morning, Palm Sunday, the 29th of March 1461, saw what is possibly the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil at Towton, where two huge armies clashed. Some contemporary sources place the number of dead at around 28,000 souls, though this may have been exaggerated. The Battle of Towton was a crushing Yorkist victory and gave Edward a tight grip on his throne, though it was made fragile by the continued evasion of capture of King Henry. The Lancastrian cause rallied only weakly during the next decade at the Battle of Hedgeley Moor on the 25th of April 1464 and the Battle of Hexham on the 15th of May the following year. Both engagements saw Yorkist victories that reinforced Edward's position as king. Peace lasted until 1469, when a culmination of slights and embarrassments, including Edward's marriage to the unpopular Elizabeth Woodville, caused his cousin, the mighty Earl of Warwick, to rebel. Warwick drew in Edward's brother George too. At the Battle of Edgecote Moor on the 26th of July 1469, Edward was defeated by a rebellion Warwick had instigated. Edward was captured, and Warwick tried to bend the king to his will. Finding that he could not break him, Warwick was forced to release the king. Edward was wounded, but found an opportunity to even the score at the Battle of Losecoat Field on the 12th of March 1470, after which Warwick and George were forced to flee to France. Soon, though, Warwick had a new cause. After over a quarter of an hour on his knees in France, Warwick was reconciled with Queen Margaret, and the two joined their forces to reignite the cause of King Henry VI. The weight of their return together forced Edward to flee this time, leaving from King's Lynn on the 2nd of October 1470 for exile in Burgundy. Edward was not to be kept down for long, though. Landing at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, he initially claimed only to seek the recovery of his lands and titles as Duke of York, but pressed south. The Lancastrian forces were disparate, old Lancastrian loyalists not wishing to trust or follow the Earl of Warwick, as Margaret dallied in France with her son, the Prince of Wales, delaying their return and depriving those loyal to her of a uniting figurehead. Edward's army engaged Warwick at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April 1471. The Earl was killed in the fighting, several Lancastrian lords having failed to join him while they waited for Margaret to return. Edward swept to victory and returned to London to reclaim his throne and to meet his namesake new son and heir, born in sanctuary while he was in exile. Queen Margaret and her son landed on the south coast, and Lancastrian lords now rallied to her. King Edward moved to engage them as they marched north, and the two sides met at the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May 1471. Henry VI's only son, Edward, Prince of Wales, was killed in the fighting, and with him died Lancastrian hope. Margaret was captured, and on King Edward's return to the capital, King Henry was put to death in the Tower of London. With the Lancastrian light snuffed out, peace settled upon England for over a decade, until Edward IV died, aged only 40, on the 9th of April 1483. His son was proclaimed King Edward V, but was never crowned. Instead, Edward IV's children were declared illegitimate, and the dead king's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III. Alienating Edwardian loyalists, uncertain of the fate of the princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, and fearing their deaths at their uncle's hands, Richard faced a rebellion that saw disaffected Yorkists turn to the last Lancastrian hope in exile, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who possessed a tenuous claim to the crown of England. The autumn of 1483 saw a rebellion in Henry Tudor's name that failed, but exposed Richard's closest ally, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, as a traitor. 2 years later, with French backing, Henry Tudor invaded again, meeting the king at the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485, where Richard III was killed and Henry VII proclaimed king, the first Tudor monarch. A Yorkist revival was attempted in the name of the son of George, Duke of Clarence, Edward IV and Richard III's brother, but it was crushed by Henry VII at the Battle of Stoke on the 16th of June 1487. The Wars of the Roses did not end there, though, casting a long shadow over the early Tudor regime and haunting even the later rule of Henry VII's son, King Henry VIII. Throughout this series of podcasts, we will navigate the battles that took place, the politics that surrounded them, and the relationships and rivalries that drove and defined a civil war. In the next episode, we will examine the downfall of a king's favourite. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wars of the Roses podcast.